In the golden haze of a Las Vegas evening, when the lights of the Strip shimmered like fallen stars, Dean Martin walked onto the stage as he had done 1,000 times before, calm and hurried, carrying that effortless charm the world had come to adore. The marquee outside the sands glowed bright. Inside, glasses clinked softly. The orchestra tuned. And at stage right stood the man who had been there for nearly a decade, his guitarist, Tommy Vale. Tommy wasn't famous. His name wasn't in lights. But those who knew music really knew it, understood that the velvet smoothness behind Dean's voice wasn't magic. It was partnership. It was precision. It was Tommy. Dean adjusted the mic, flashing a lazy grin. "Evenin', folks. Hope you didn't come for the weather forecast," he drawled. The crowd laughed. The band struck the first chord of That's Amor, but something was different. Tommy's usual fluidity, his way of making the strings whisper and weep, felt hesitant. A fraction late. A shade softer. Dean noticed instantly. He always did. Dean Martin had a gift beyond timing and tone. He read rooms. He read people. Midway through the set, Dean drifted toward Tommy, crooning through the melody while watching him carefully. Under the stage lights, Tommy's smile looked strained. His left hand trembled slightly between chord changes. After the final applause, after the last autograph was signed and the casino floor hummed with midnight gamblers, Dean didn't head to his suite. He found Tommy alone backstage, sitting on a wooden crate, guitar resting across his knees like something fragile. "Tom," Dean said gently, dropping the showman's voice. "You play like you got ghosts in your fingers tonight." Tommy forced a chuckle. "Just tired, Dean." "Long week." Dean leaned against the wall, lighting a cigarette. He didn't press yet. "You know," Dean said, exhaling slowly, "I've been singing long enough to know the difference between tired and troubled." Silence hung thick between them. Finally, Tommy looked down at his hands. "It's nothing," he muttered. Dean didn't move. Didn't interrupt. After a long pause, Tommy whispered, "Doc says I need surgery soon." Dean's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "What kind, hand?" "Nerve damage. If I don't fix it, I won't play again." The words seemed to echo in the quiet dressing room. Dean removed the cigarette from his lips. "So fix it." Tommy gave a hollow laugh. "Sure. I'll just pull $20,000 out of my guitar case." Dean's jaw tightened. Insurance wouldn't cover it. The band's pay barely covered rent. Tommy had a wife. 2 little girls. Medical bills stacked like unpaid apologies. Dean didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded once, slow and thoughtful. "You tell the rest of the boys," he asked. "No. Don't want pity." Dean smiled faintly. "Good. I don't like pity either." Tommy looked up. "Dean, I'll manage." "I just needed to say it out loud." Dean clapped him on the shoulder. "You always did talk too much," but his eyes were distant now. That night, in his suite overlooking the glittering city, Dean poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. He thought about the years Tommy had stood by him. The rehearsals. The missed holidays. The loyalty. Fame, Dean knew, was fickle. But loyalty, that was sacred. The next evening, before the show, Dean gathered the orchestra in the rehearsal room. "Fellas," he began casually, "we're making a small change." The band exchanged curious looks. "Tonight's performance," Dean continued, "is a private charity show." One of the trumpet players frowned. "Charity for who?" Dean glanced at Tommy, who stood confused near the piano. "For one of our own." Tommy's eyes widened. Dean raised a hand gently. "You play the strings, kid. Let me handle the strings attached." Word spread quietly through the casino. A last-minute special engagement. Tickets were doubled in price. The wealthy regulars didn't blink. If anything, exclusivity excited them. The theater filled beyond capacity. Dean stepped on stage, spotlight warm against his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, Tonight ain't about me. It ain't about the Rat Pack. It ain't even about Vegas." He paused. "It's about gratitude." The audience shifted, intrigued. Dean gestured toward Tommy. "This man right here has been the heartbeat behind my songs for years. And sometimes, the people behind the curtain need the loudest applause." Tommy froze. Dean continued smoothly, turning sincerity into poetry. "So tonight, every dollar you spend, every drink, every ticket goes to making sure those hands keep playing." The room erupted. Tommy stood motionless, overwhelmed. The band launched into a slow instrumental. Dean began singing not one of his hits, but an old Italian ballad his father used to hum. Halfway through, Dean stepped aside. "Tommy," he called softly, "why don't you show 'em what they're saving?" Tommy hesitated. The crowd began clapping rhythmically. With trembling fingers, he stepped forward. And then he played. Not perfectly. Not flawlessly. But with soul. Every note carried hope. Every chord carried gratitude. When the last string vibrated into silence, the theater rose to its feet. Dean didn't take the spotlight back. He simply stood behind Tommy, hands resting lightly on his shoulders. Backstage later, the casino manager approached Dean, envelope in hand. "You raised more than enough," he said quietly. Dean shook his head. "Not enough." He pulled out his checkbook and added a figure that made the manager blink. "Make sure his girls get through college too," Dean said calmly. The manager stared. "That's more than the surgery," Dean shrugged. "Music ain't just notes. It's family." A week later, Tommy stood outside a hospital room, surgery scheduled. Dean arrived unannounced, carrying nothing but a thermos of coffee. "You don't have to stay," Tommy said, voice thick with emotion. Dean leaned against the wall. "Kid," he replied softly, "I've headlined bigger rooms than this. But none more important." Tommy's surgery lasted hours. Dean waited. When the doctor finally emerged with a smile, Dean didn't ask about success. He asked, "Will he play?" The doctor nodded. "With therapy, yes." Dean exhaled deeply. Months later, under the bright Vegas lights once again, Dean introduced a familiar sound. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice warm, "some music you hear. And some music you fight for." Tommy stepped forward. This time, his hands were steady. The first chord rang clear, stronger than ever. Dean glanced at him, eyes shining slightly. "Welcome home, pal." The crowd didn't know the full story. They didn't need to. Because sometimes, the greatest acts aren't performed under spotlights. They're performed behind them. And that night, in a city built on glitter and illusion, something real had taken center stage. The weeks after Tommy's surgery moved slowly, like a song played at half-tempo. Las Vegas kept shining. The crowds kept filling the showroom. And Dean Martin kept stepping onto the stage with that familiar relaxed smile. But anyone who truly knew the music could hear it. Something was missing. Tommy's chair at stage right remained empty. Dean never mentioned it to the audience. He never dramatized the situation. He simply adjusted the arrangements. The orchestra carried more weight. The piano filled spaces the guitar once owned. But between verses, in the quiet spaces where Tommy's strings used to glide in like silk, there was a small, noticeable absence. Backstage, Dean made a habit of calling the hospital after every show. "How are the hands tonight?" he would ask. The answer was never rush. Recovery required patience. Nerves heal slowly. Muscles forget before they remember. Tommy struggled more than he admitted. Physical therapy felt humiliating at times. The simplest finger stretches exhausted him. There were days he stared at his guitar case from across the room and couldn't bring himself to open it. One afternoon, Dean showed up at Tommy's house unannounced. Tommy answered the door in sweatpants, surprise written across his face. "Dean. What are you doing here?" Dean stepped inside casually. "I was in the neighborhood." Tommy raised an eyebrow. They both knew Dean didn't have business in quiet suburban streets. Dean spotted the guitar resting on the couch. "You playing?" he asked. Tommy hesitated. Trying, Dean walked over and picked it up carefully, almost respectfully. He handed it back. "Then try with me." Tommy shook his head. "I can't keep up." Dean pulled a kitchen chair to the center of the living room and sat down. "I don't need you to keep up. I need you to start." There was no spotlight. No orchestra. No applause waiting at the end. Just two men in a quiet house, sunlight falling through half-closed blinds. Tommy positioned his fingers. They trembled slightly. Dean began humming softly, not even a full song, just a melody, steady and simple. No pressure. No audience. Tommy played one chord. It buzzed imperfectly. Dean didn't react. Another chord, cleaner. They repeated the sequence again and again. For nearly an hour. When Tommy's hand began to tire, he stopped abruptly, frustrated. "I used to play without thinking," he said quietly. "Now I have to think about every finger." Dean leaned back in his chair. "Kid," he replied calmly, "the best musicians don't play without thinking. They play through feeling." Tommy looked at him. "You're not relearning music," Dean continued. "You're relearning yourself." The words stayed with Tommy long after Dean left. Recovery became routine. Therapy sessions in the morning. Light practice in the afternoon. Ice packs at night. The pain was real, but so was the progress. Dean adjusted his tour schedule quietly, building in longer breaks between performances. When producers questioned the changes, he brushed them off with a grin. "Even a crooner needs to breathe," he would say. But those close to him knew the truth. He wanted Tommy ready, not rushed. 3 months later, during rehearsal at the Sands, Dean gathered the orchestra. "We're adding something back tonight," he announced. Tommy stood near the stage entrance, guitar strapped over his shoulder. His palms were sweating. The band members clapped lightly as he walked to his old spot. It felt familiar, yet different, like returning to a childhood home that had been repainted. Dean approached him quietly. "No pressure," Dean murmured. "Miss a note, I'll blame the trumpet section." Tommy laughed, tension easing just enough. That evening, the showroom buzzed with the usual glamour. No announcements were made. No grand introductions. Dean began the set as always, a smooth and hurried. Halfway through the second number, he stepped slightly aside and nodded. Tommy's cue. The first chord rang out steady, warm, unmistakable. A subtle shift moved through the band. The sound was fuller now, balanced, whole. Dean didn't look at the audience. He looked at Tommy. And Tommy didn't look at his hands. He played. Not perfectly. Not flawlessly. But confidently. When the song ended, the applause felt different, stronger, almost instinctive. The crowd didn't know why the music felt richer that night. They just felt it. Backstage after the show, Tommy exhaled deeply. "I was terrified," he admitted. Dean loosened his tie. "Good," he said. "Means you care." Tommy studied him for a moment. "Why did you really do all this?" he asked quietly. "The show. The money. The waiting." Dean paused before answering. "Because one day," he said slowly, "someone gave me a chance when I wasn't sure I deserved it." He placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "And I never forgot the sound of that kindness." The lights outside the casino shimmered through the hallway windows. The world kept spinning. The crowds would keep coming. But for those two men, the music meant something deeper now. It wasn't just performance. It was perseverance. And in the silence between the notes, friendship had become the strongest melody of all. By the time autumn settled over Las Vegas, the rhythm of the showroom had fully returned. The lights were brighter, the laughter louder, and the music felt complete again. At stage right, Tommy stood steady, his fingers moving with confidence that had once seemed impossible to reclaim. To the audience, it was just another flawless season headlined by Dean Martin. But behind the curtain, something had shifted. Tommy no longer played as a background musician hoping to keep up. He played like someone who had nearly lost everything and earned it back. One evening after rehearsal, a well-dressed producer from Los Angeles waited backstage. He praised the performance, complimented the arrangements, and then made his offer. "Dean, we're putting together a special television concert," the producer said smoothly. "National broadcast. Big sponsors. We'll need to tighten the sound. Top session players. Absolute precision." Dean listened without interruption. The producer continued, lowering his voice slightly. "No room for weakness. We can't afford risk." Tommy, across the room, pretended not to hear. But every word landed. Dean took a slow sip of water. "You saying my band's a risk?" he asked calmly. "Not the whole band," the producer replied carefully. "Just, we want perfection." The implication hung in the air. Tommy's recovery had been strong, but he wasn't as mechanically flawless as before. His playing carried feeling now, sometimes unpredictable, sometimes raw. The producer leaned in. "We'll cover the extra cost." "It's business." Dean stood up and hurried. "Business," he repeated softly. He walked toward Tommy, who kept adjusting his strings, eyes down. "Tom," Dean said lightly, "you feel like a risk tonight." Tommy looked up, confused. "No. I feel ready." Dean turned back to the producer. "Then we're ready." The producer hesitated. "Dean, this is prime-time television." Dean's expression remained relaxed, but his voice carried weight. "Music ain't surgery," he said. "It's heart. And I don't replace heart." The room fell silent. The producer tried one final angle. "Audiences expect excellence." Dean nodded. "Then we'll give them truth." "That's better." The meeting ended without signatures. Later that night, as the band packed up, Tommy approached Dean quietly. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Dean adjusted his cufflinks. "Sure I did. You could have had the best players in the country." Dean smiled slightly. "I already do." Tommy didn't respond. The weight of loyalty is sometimes heavier than gratitude. Weeks passed. The television special moved forward on Dean's terms. Rehearsals were intense. Cameras demanded precision. Producers watched every detail. Tommy practiced longer than anyone else. Early mornings. Late nights. His fingertips hardened again. Not out of fear but pride. On the night of the broadcast, the studio lights felt hotter than any Vegas spotlight. The audience was quieter, aware of the cameras. Dean stepped to the microphone, composed as ever. "Good evening," he began smoothly. "Tonight, we're not chasing perfect. We're playing honest." The orchestra began. The first few songs moved flawlessly. Then came the ballad, the one built around a delicate guitar introduction. Tommy's moment. He inhaled slowly. His fingers found the strings. The opening notes drifted through the studio, soft, steady, alive. There was no tremble now. No hesitation. Dean listened, eyes half closed, letting the guitar carry the emotion before his voice entered. When he finally sang, the connection between them felt visible, like a thread pulled tight between melody and meaning. The performance ended to sustained applause. Backstage, even the skeptical producer nodded. "That was," he paused, searching for the word, "real." Dean simply shrugged. "Told you." Later, alone in the dressing room, Tommy sat quietly, guitar resting against his knee. "I kept thinking I had something to prove," he admitted. Dean loosened his tie. "You did," he said. Tommy looked surprised. "To yourself," Dean added. "Not to them." Tommy let that settle. The broadcast would be remembered as one of Dean's most heartfelt performances. Critics praised the authenticity. Viewers wrote letters about the emotion in the music. But what most never knew was this: The true performance wasn't just on camera. It had started months earlier in a quiet living room, with shaking fingers and a single chord. Loyalty had taken the stage long before the spotlight ever turned on. And that night, it played in perfect time. The years moved forward the way they always do, quietly, without asking permission. The showroom crowds in Las Vegas continued to fill their seats, glasses clinking beneath the glow of chandeliers. At center stage stood Dean Martin, still effortless, still calm. And at stage right, Tommy played with a steadiness that no longer felt fragile. But something had changed in both men. Tommy no longer measured his worth by perfection. The months of recovery had reshaped him. Every note he played now carried memory of fear, of doubt, of a friend who refused to let him fall quietly into the background. Dean, for his part, seemed softer off stage. Success had always surrounded him, but loyalty had grounded him. He had seen how quickly circumstances could shift. One diagnosis. One phone call. One fragile moment. One evening after a performance, as the band packed up their instruments, Tommy lingered near the empty seats. The theater lights had dimmed, leaving only a faint golden wash across the stage. Dean noticed. "You planning to sleep here?" he asked casually. Tommy smiled faintly. "Just thinking, careful. That's dangerous." Tommy looked out at the empty room. "I used to think this stage was everything," he said. "Now I realize it's just a place. What matters is who stands beside you on it." Dean didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly to the center of the stage and looked out at the silent chairs. "You know why I helped you?" he asked. Tommy hesitated. "Because you're generous." Dean shook his head. "No. Because I've seen what happens when people get replaced like furniture. Fame does that. One day you're necessary. The next day you're optional." He paused. "I don't believe in optional people." The words settled heavily between them. In the months that followed, Tommy began mentoring younger musicians who joined the orchestra. When a nervous teenage substitute guitarist showed up one afternoon, hands shaking before rehearsal, Tommy recognized the look instantly. "Play the first chord," Tommy told him gently. The boy stumbled through it. "Good," Tommy said. "Now play it again." Dean watched from across the stage, a faint smile on his face. Kindness had traveled full circle. The television special from the previous year continued to receive praise. Critics spoke of its authenticity. Viewers wrote letters describing how the music felt different, deeper, warmer. They weren't wrong. It wasn't technical brilliance that people remembered. It was connection. One night, after a particularly strong performance, a young reporter approached Dean backstage. "What's the secret?" she asked. "You've stayed relevant for so long." "How?" Dean considered the question carefully. "It's simple," he said. "You take care of the people who help you sing." The answer didn't make headlines. It wasn't dramatic enough. But for those who lived it, it was everything. Years later, when the lights of that famous showroom eventually dimmed for the last time, the memory of those nights remained vivid. Tommy would often recall the quiet afternoon in his living room, the sunlight, the simple melody, the first shaky chord after surgery. That was the true turning point. Not the standing ovation. Not the broadcast. Not the applause. Just two men in a quiet space, choosing loyalty over convenience. On the final night they performed together, the audience rose in a long, sustained ovation. Dean gave his usual modest nod, gesturing toward the orchestra. But this time, he stepped aside completely. "Take it home, Tom," he said softly. Tommy began to play strong, steady, full. Dean stood behind him, hands resting lightly at his sides, content to let the music speak. Because sometimes the greatest legacy isn't measured in awards or headlines. It's measured in the lives we refuse to let disappear when the spotlight shifts. And long after the curtains closed and the theater emptied, that quiet promise between them remained stronger than applause, steadier than fame, and lasting far beyond the final note.